What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sand. And right now, I'm feeling like 100 grand.
You are listening to Inspired Insider with your host, Dr. Jeremy Wise.
Dr. Jeremy Wise here, founder of InspiredInsider.com, where I talk with inspirational entrepreneurs and leaders. Today is no different. I have Kim Scott, Radical Candor and Radical Respect. Check both of those books out. They're fantastic. And Kim, before I formally introduce you, I always like to point out other episodes of the podcast people should check out. And since this is one of my favorite books, Radical Candor is definitely one of my favorite books, and it's been mentioned numerous times on the podcast. Some of the other interviews I've done with fantastic authors include Jeff Wetzler of Ask. Actually, he brought up your book, Tap into the Hidden Wisdom of People Around You for Unexpected Breakthroughs in Leadership and Life. Scaling Up by Vern Harnish. Traction by Gino Wickman. That was a good episode. Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. 80/20 Sales and Marketing by Perry Marshall. Stand Out by Dory Clark, and Giftology by John Ruhlin, some of my favorites. I don't know if you have any of your favorites. I know Gretchen Rubin wrote something nice about you, and also Angela Duckworth is on the cover of Radical Respect. What are some of your favorites? Kim?
I feel really lucky with Dan Pink also helped me name Radical Candor. So props to him, and endorsed both Radical Candor and Radical Respect. Henry Louis Gates Jr. Also endorsed Radical Respect. And Sarah Kuntz also endorsed Radical Respect. So I feel very fortunate to have even a blurb from Adam Grant. So feel very lucky.
I love it. Yeah, I love Adam Grant's books too. So, well, I'll go and talk a little bit more about Kim in a second. This episode is brought to you by Rise 25. At Rise 25, we help businesses give to and connect to their dream relationships and partnerships. And how do we do that? We do that by helping you run your podcast. We're an easy button for a company to launch and run a podcast. We do the strategy, the accountability, and the full execution. Can we call ourselves the magic elves that run in the background, that make it look easy for the host so they can just run their company and create amazing content. For me, the number one thing in my life is relationships, and I'm always looking at ways to give to my best relationships. And I have found no better way over the past decade to profile the people and companies I most admire on this planet and share with the world what they're working on. So if you've thought about podcasting, you should. Kim has a few podcasts, actually. Definitely do. If you have questions about it, you can go to rise25.com or email us at support@rise25.com. I am excited to introduce Kim Scott, the author of Radical Respect and Radical Candor. The Radical Candor approach is a combination, I would say, of caring personally while challenging directly. And it's helped many leaders move from a command and control culture to one of collaboration. And the Radical Candor framework was developed by Kim as a communication framework for specific and sincere praise and kind and clear criticism. And we're going to go into the Radical Candor approach and framework, as well as the Radical Respect approach and framework. Her background is really impressive. Was a CEO coach at Dropbox, Twitter, and other tech companies. She was a member of the faculty at Apple University. Before that, Kim actually led AdSense, YouTube, and DoubleClick teams at Google. And she cut her teeth as a leader with her software startup. I think she raised millions of dollars for that. And I'm not sure if everyone knows this about you, Kim, but I know you also managed a pediatric clinic in Kosovo and did work at the diamond cutting factory in Moscow. So, Kim, thanks for joining me.
Thank you. I'm excited for our conversation.
So I'm going to share my screen. This is a video too. If you're listening to audio, you can check the video out as well. And I just want to start with the Radical Candor framework. And let me pull up this so you can see here, right? RadicalCandor.com. You can check out all of her work there. You can see the Radical Candor book, the Radical Respect book as well. And I know the newest work is Radical Respect. This is built off of all your years' experience, but I want to start with Radical Candor. Can you just talk about a little bit about this framework for a second?
Sure, absolutely. Radical candor is what happens when you show that you care personally and challenge directly at the same time, as you said before. Radical candor is often mistaken for obnoxious aggression, which it is not. Sometimes I'll be working with a team and someone will charge into a room and say, in the spirit of radical candor, and then they proceed to act like a garden variety jerk. That is not the spirit of radical candor. That is the spirit of obnoxious aggression. Obnoxious aggression is what happens when you remember to challenge directly, but you forget to show that you care personally, or maybe you don't actually care. And obnoxious aggression is a problem for a bunch of reasons. First and foremost, it's a problem because it hurts other people. It's also a problem because it's inefficient. If I am a jerk to you, you go into fight or flight mode, and then you literally cannot hear what I'm saying, so I am wasting my breath. I think it's also a problem because I don't know about you, Jeremy, but when I realize that I've landed here in obnoxious aggression, it's not my instinct to go the right way on the care personally dimension. Instead, it's my instinct to go the wrong way on challenge directly. And then I wind up in the worst place of all, manipulative insincerity. If obnoxious aggression is front stabbing, manipulative insincerity is backstabbing. Manipulative insincerity is where passive aggressive behavior, political behavior, all of the stuff that erodes trust most insidiously in an organization creeps in. And it's kind of fun to talk about both obnoxious aggression and manipulative insincerity because that's where the drama is. In fact, the HBO show Silicon Valley did a whole episode on what they called radical candor, but what was actually obnoxious aggression and manipulative insincerity. The thing is, though, that these are not the quadrants where we make most of our mistakes. The vast majority of us make the vast majority of our mistakes in this last box, the upper left-hand quadrant, where we do remember to show that we care personally, but we are so worried about not offending someone or not hurting their feelings that we fail to challenge them directly. And that's what I call ruinous empathy. So that is the TLDR on Radical Candor, but please do read it.
I want to, we'll talk about some of your favorite stories here. One of my favorite stories from the book, and I'll let you paint the picture, but I think in the room was Eric Schmidt, Sheryl Sandberg, Sergey Brin. When you walked into this room, just explain to people what you were seeing.
Yeah, so I had just gotten a new job at Google, and I had to give a presentation a few months after I had joined about how the AdSense business was doing. And I walked into the room, and there in one corner of the room was Sergey Brin on an elliptical trainer, stepping away, wearing toe shoes and a bright blue spandex unitard, super tight. Not what I was expecting.
That's what I wear.
Yeah, me too. Not what I was wanting to see when I walked into the room. And there in the other corner of the room was Eric Schmidt doing his email. It was like his brain had been plugged into the machine. So probably like you in such a situation, I felt a little bit nervous. How was I supposed to get these people's attention? Luckily for me, the AdSense business was on fire. And when I said how many new customers we had added over the last couple of months, Eric almost fell off his chair. Why did you say this is incredible? Do you need more engineers? Do you need more marketing dollars? So at this point, I'm feeling like the meeting's going all right. In fact, I now believe that I'm a genius. And I walked out of the room. I walked past my boss, who is Sheryl Sandberg, and I'm expecting a high five, a pat on the back. And instead, Sheryl says to me, why don't you walk back to my office with me? And I thought, oh, wow, I messed something up, and I'm sure I'm about to hear about it. Now, she began not by telling me what I had done wrong, but by giving me some kudos for what had gone well in the meeting, not in the sort of shit sandwich sense of the word, but really seeming to mean what she was saying. And, but of course, all I wanted to hear about was what I had done wrong. Eventually, she said to me, you said a lot in there. Were you aware of it? And with this, I breathed a huge sigh of relief, because if that was all I had done wrong, who really cared? And I kind of made this brush off gesture with my hand. I said, yeah, I know, it's a verbal tic. It's no big deal, really. And then she said to me, I know a great speech coach. I bet Google would pay for it. Would you like an introduction? And once again, I made this brush off gesture with my hand. I said, no, I don't have time. Didn't you hear about all these new customers? I don't have time for a speech coach. And then she stopped. She looked me right in the eye and she said, I can tell when you do that thing with your hand that I'm going to have to be a lot more direct with you. When you say every third word, it makes you sound stupid. Now she's got my full attention. And some people might call what she said to me obnoxious aggression. They might say that it was mean of her to say that I sounded stupid. But in fact, it was the kindest thing that she could have done for me at that moment in my career. Because if she hadn't used just those words with me, and by the way, she never would have used those words with other people on her team who were perhaps better listeners and maybe a little more sensitive than I was. But she knew me well enough to know that if she didn't use just those words with me, that I wouldn't go visit the speech coach and I wouldn't learn that she was not exaggerating. I literally said every third word. And this was news to me because I had raised money, millions of dollars for 2 different startups giving presentations. I thought I was pretty good at it. And that made me sort of wonder, what was it about her first of all, why had no one else told me? But what was it about her management style that made it so seemingly easy for her to tell me? And that was when I really started thinking about care personally and challenge directly. I knew that she cared about me and cared about me not just as an employee, but as a human being, because she would do things like when I moved from New York to California to take the job at Google, I didn't know anyone here in California, or I didn't know very many people, and I was lonely. And she could tell that I was lonely. And she introduced me to a book group. I'm still friends. In fact, I just went to that book group last night. I'm still friends with those people to this day. Also, and that was the kind of thing she did not only for me, but for everyone who worked directly with her. She couldn't do that kind of stuff for all 5,000 people in her organization. No matter how talented you are, relationships don't scale. But culture does scale. And when a leader treats their direct reports with that kind of care, then it's much more likely in turn that their direct reports will understand it's their job to treat their direct reports with that kind of care. And that does scale, that kind of caring, that kind of culture of caring. But it wasn't, of course, all sunshine and roses. I also knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that if I screwed up, she was going to tell me in no uncertain terms. She was going to make sure that that she got through to me. And that's the challenge directly part of the equation.
I've definitely, Kim, had people rip into me online of how I'm talking. And I think it was more obnoxious aggression because I don't know if they care for me personally, but that was still helpful, honestly.
Yeah.
And I still took their advice. I'm like, they're totally accurate with that. And I had to reevaluate sometimes how I talk or some of the gestures I make. So it's definitely helpful.
Yeah. And by the way, you made a really important point there. Like, obnoxious aggression is bad, but it's more helpful than either ruinous empathy or manipulative insincerity. If you can sort of pan for gold or separate the wheat from the chaff of the obnoxious aggression that you get. I think that's important to write. I am not condoning obnoxious aggression. I want to be very clear. But ruinous empathy feels nicer and is actually meaner in the long run.
So in the obnoxious aggression, so if you're looking at the video, you can see the chart here. Would you consider the Larry Page interaction under obnoxious aggression?
No, not at all. I mean, again, shortly after I joined Google, I got into an argument with Larry. Well, Larry, I was obnoxious to Larry. Larry was not obnoxious to me. Which story do you want?
The one I think more of you instigating.
Yes, where I was the obnoxious one. So Larry and I got into an argument about an AdSense policy. And I sent an email to him and about 30 other people. By the way, mistake number 1 was email. I should have had a conversation in person. Mistake number 2 was CCing 30 other people. And the email read, here comes mistake number 3, the obnoxious part. Larry claims he wants to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. But if it'll make us a buck, he's willing to create clutter sites that muddle the world's information. Very clever, but obnoxious. And shortly after I sent that email, a friend of mine called me up and said, Kim, why did you do that? And let's think for a minute. Why did I do that? It's worth pondering. I think I did that because I believe, like I bet you believe, and all of your listeners believe, that there's a special place in hell for people who kiss up and kick down. But that doesn't mean that doing the exact opposite is such a brilliant move either. So you don't, if you find that you've landed in obnoxious aggression, the right thing for me to have done would have been to show I care personally, and because common human decency is the one thing that we owe to everyone who we work with, regardless of who they are in the company. So it's no better to be obnoxiously aggressive. Well, it's worse to be obnoxiously aggressive to people who have less power than you, but that doesn't mean it's good to be obnoxiously aggressive to people who have more power than you. So what I did was I made a mistake after I got that phone call that I think a lot of people make. Instead of moving the right way on care personally, I went the wrong way on challenge directly and wound up in the worst place of all. Here's my hero's journey to manipulative insincerity. The next time I saw Larry, I said, "Oh, Larry, I'm so sorry about that email. You're right, I'm wrong." 2 problems with that. One is that I was lying. I did not think I was wrong. And the second problem is that Larry, like most people, has a pretty good BS meter, and he could tell I was lying. And he said, he kind of looked at me, glared at me, he said nothing, and he just stalked off. It was one of those cringe moments. The guy sitting next to me looked at me and he said, I think he likes it better when you disagree with him than when you pretend to agree and you don't agree. So if you find that you've landed in obnoxious aggression, don't make that mistake. Don't go the wrong way on challenge directly. Instead, go the right way on care personally.
So it would be less, Kim, manipulative insincerity if you actually said, you know what, if you were stating reasons of why, I looked into it and I see your position is X, Y, Z, and you actually did come to agreement and gave specific reasons for it,
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, I don't think I could have, I think what I should have said is, Larry, I'm sorry, my email was obnoxious. I shouldn't have sent an email. And I also shouldn't have CC'd 30 people, so I should have acknowledged what I did wrong. And then what I would say is, but I still disagree with your policy. Maybe I'm wrong. I want to understand why. I want to better understand why you think this is the right policy. That's, I think, would have been a better way to handle it.
You mentioned something I know you talk about in the book, I've heard this talked about before, is kind of a feedback sandwich. And you kind of debunked that a little bit. Yeah.
I think that it is really radical candor. There's an order of operations. It always starts with soliciting radical candor. And then the next step is to give praise. And you want to give more praise than criticism. So I don't want to say that praise is unimportant. Praise is really important. But if you try to boil it down to a ratio and you say give, twice as much praise as you do criticism, then you wind up often saying insincere things like, "Oh, Kim, I like your bookshelves. Your books kind of suck, but those are cool glasses." Like, that doesn't make me feel any better, right? And people see through that. So you want to make sure that both your praise and your criticism are radically candid. Don't make the mistake of thinking that praise is how you show you care personally and criticism is how you challenge directly, because you'll wind up giving ruinously empathetic praise and obnoxiously aggressive criticism if you do that. Both praise and criticism are equally important. And again, your job, especially if you're a leader, but no matter who you are, your job is to paint a picture of what's possible. And praise is a better tool for that than criticism.
I want to kind of complete the cycle here. We have radical candor, obnoxious aggression, manipulative insincerity, and then, the biggest mistake you say people make is ruinous empathy.
Yeah.
And I know this happened with your startup, and it may be tough for people. Is there some examples that you could, so people can practice, like building up the muscle of telling people? For me, it's like confrontation can be difficult, and sometimes I don't know how it's going to be received. So how do you recommend people building the muscle of giving people direct feedback, I guess?
Yeah. I think one of the most important things you can do, especially if you find yourself falling into ruinous empathy a lot, is to think about a time when you didn't say the thing to the person, just trying to be nice, and then the results were really bad for that other person. So, for example, at one point, here's my story. And every time I'm tempted not to say the thing, I think about, quote unquote, Bob. That's not really his name, but anyway, I had hired this person, we'll call him Bob, and I liked Bob a lot. He was smart, he was charming, he was funny. He would do stuff like we were at a manager offsite, and we were playing one of those endless get to know you games. And Bob was the person who had the courage to raise his hand and to say, I can tell everybody's getting really stressed out, wants to get back to work. I've got an idea. It'll help us get to know each other, and it'll be really fast. Whatever his idea was, if it was fast, we were down with it. So Bob says, let's just go around the table and confess what candy our parents used when potty training us. Really weird, but really fast. Weirder yet, we all remembered Hershey Kisses right here. And then for the next 10 months, every time there was a tense moment in a meeting, Bob would pull out just the right piece of candy for the right person at the right moment. So Bob was quirky, but he brought a little levity to the office. One problem with Bob, he was doing terrible work. His work was riddled with sloppy mistakes. And I was so puzzled because he had this incredible resume, this great history of accomplishments. I couldn't understand what was going on. I learned much later that the problem was that Bob was smoking pot in the bathroom 3 times a day, which maybe explained all that candy that he had at all times. But I didn't know any of that at the time. All I knew was that Bob was handing stuff into me, and there was shame in his eyes. And what would I say? Instead of saying what I should have said, instead of being radically candid, I would say something along the lines of, oh, Bob, this is a great start. You are so awesome. We all love working with you. Maybe you can make it just a little bit better. That, of course, never worked. He never did make it a little bit better. So let's pause for a moment and think about, why was I saying something so useless to Bob? Part of it was truly ruinous empathy. I really did like him, and I really was loath to hurt his feelings. But if I'm honest with myself, there was something more insidious going on. There was some manipulative insincerity going on, because Bob was popular and Bob was also sensitive. And there was part of me that was afraid that if I told Bob in no uncertain terms that his work wasn't really good enough, he would get upset. He might even start to cry, and then everybody would think I was a big you-know-what. So the part of me that was worried about my reputation as a leader, that was the manipulative insincerity part. The part of me that was worried about Bob's feelings, that was the ruinous empathy part. And often these two things, this is not like MISI in McKinsey speak, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. These things blur together. And so this is going on. It's going on for 10 months. And eventually the inevitable happens. And I realized that if I don't fire Bob, I am going to lose all my best performers on the team. And so I sit down, because not only have I been unfair to Bob not to tell him, I've been unfair to everyone on the team. Their deliverables are late because his deliverables are late. They are not able to spend as much time as they need to on their work because they're having to spend so much time redoing Bob's work. And if I don't get rid of Bob, they're going to quit. So I sat down with Bob to have a conversation that I should have begun, frankly, 10 months previously. And when I finished explaining to him where things stood, he kind of pushed his chair back from the table. He looked me right in the eye and he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And as that question was going around in my head with no good answer, he looked at me again and he said, "Why didn't anyone tell me? I thought you all cared about me." And now I realize that by not giving Bob the feedback that he needed, thinking I was being nice, I'm having to fire him as a result of it. Not so nice after all. But it was too late to save Bob. Even Bob at this point agreed that he should go because his reputation on the team was just shot. All I could do in the moment was make myself a very solemn promise that I would never make that mistake again, and that I would do everything in my power to help other people avoid making that mistake, because it is so painful for all of us. It was painful for me. It was much worse for Bob. It was bad for the whole team, and it was bad for our investors because we weren't getting stuff done.
Yeah, and in a couple parts of the book, thanks for sharing that. That you talk about too, which is kind of like a spinach in the teeth example where like, would you let your friend, or would you want someone to tell you, because after reading your book, I see someone at the table and they have like a big chunk of something. Before I'm maybe like, they'll figure it out. And now I'm like, hey, you have something in your teeth, right? And you also talk, and you could hear there's a body odor example in the book.
Yeah.
So people can answer that. You have to read the book for that one. But there's a lot of great stories and great examples. One thing, Kim, one of my favorite parts of the book that I took back and implemented was going to the team and saying, what should I start doing and what should I stop doing so I can be better? And what was interesting about that exercise is, I don't know, people want to be nice, right? And so I really have to dig a little bit. And one of the things I find, and I get like I don't know if it's an uncomfortable laugh out of people, but I'm like, listen, I'm definitely not perfect, right? And so then they uncomfortably laugh like, yeah, that's true, Jeremy. But like, I'm still trying to get the team to have radical candor with me. And sometimes it's not easy. I know you've had people say, hey, I did this with my boss and I got fired. And you're like, well, maybe you should have a different boss. But I did get some interesting answers. So thank you. I encourage people, check that part out. And that was very helpful for me. And I think I have to build that muscle with the team too.
Yeah, I think that especially when you're a leader, but no matter what your role is in the situation, it's the same up, down, and sideways. There's an order of operations to radical candor, and it should always begin with soliciting feedback, because you want to know what the other person thinks. And if you get good at soliciting feedback, you get this superpower of knowing what other people think. And not only do you need a good question, you also need to learn how to embrace the discomfort after you ask your question, because no matter how good your question is, the other person, as you said, is going to feel uncomfortable. And simple tactic here is close your mouth and count to 6.
Yeah.
That was 6
Not
seconds.
easy to
It's
do.
a long time, and you said, just as I hit 6, like the other person is going to jump in at 6 seconds. So they may not tell you the most profound thing, but they'll say something in all likelihood. And so your next step is to manage your own tendency to be defensive. Even though you just solicited feedback, you're probably going to feel defensive when you get it. And that's okay. Extend yourself a little grace. It doesn't mean you're shut down to feedback or lesser mortal. It just means that you're human, and your humanity is all part of this. So you want to try to learn how to ask some follow-up questions to manage your own defensiveness. And last but not least, you want to reward the candor. So if you agree with the feedback, fix the problem. If you disagree with the feedback, don't just say thank you for the feedback, because that sounds like F you, actually. You want to make sure that you are taking the time to think about what's the 1 or 2% or 10%. They said something you could agree with. So give voice to that just to show that you were listening. And then offer a respectful explanation of why you disagree, if you disagree. I think that's so important. And if you can, you want to listen, challenge, commit. And especially if you're the leader, the more often you can commit to their, if you have, Russ Laraway always used to say to his direct reports, if we have data, let's do what the data says. If all we have are opinions, let's go with yours. So commit to doing things the way your direct reports recommend, unless you have some information that you are certain that you're right about, which certain that you're right is something we should very rarely be.
So check out Radical Candor. I want to talk about radical respect. And like with the way I see it, Kim, like you could just have rode the Radical Candor wave and just kept doing Radical Candor. So I'm curious of what made you decide to write Radical Respect.
So if you write a book about feedback, you're going to get a lot of it. And indeed, I did. And hands down, the best feedback that I got about Radical Candor is what prompted me to write Radical Respect. I was giving a tech talk at a Radical Candor talk at a tech company in San Francisco. And the CEO of that company is a person who I like and respect enormously, and one of too few Black women CEOs in tech, or frankly, in any other sector. And when I finished giving the Radical Candor talk, she pulled me aside and she said, Kim, I'm excited to roll out Radical Candor. I think it's going to help me build the kind of innovative culture that I need. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me to roll it out than it is for you. And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would offer anyone, even the most compassionate, gentle criticism, they would call her an angry Black woman. And I knew this was true. And I knew how unfair it was and how disrespectful it was. And so that's what made me really take a step back and say, okay, if we're going to care personally and challenge directly, we need to respect each other. Because if you don't respect someone, you're not going to challenge them and you're not going to care about them. And by respect, the word respect has two very different definitions, confusingly. One is something that one has to earn. I have to earn your respect as a leader, as a writer, whatever, by doing the thing. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the unconditional regard that we owe each other for who we are, what we bring to the table, for our backgrounds, our emotions, etc. And so what are the conditions for creating a radically respectful environment so that radical candor is possible? Because radical respect is really the prequel to radical candor. And I think in order to create radical respect, you want to make sure that you are optimizing for collaboration rather than coercion, that you're creating hierarchy. I think is inevitable and necessary, but you want to create a collaborative hierarchy, not a dominant hierarchy where people feel coerced. So that's one dimension of radical respect. The other is you want to honor everyone's individuality. And it's interesting to think about why doesn't this happen? Because sometimes, we do wind up demanding conformity at work. But sometimes it's intentional, but it's rarely intentional. Like I've never met anyone who says, what I really want to do is create a dystopic 1984 style, everybody's marching in lockstep, kind of wearing the same clothes kind of work environment. We know that we need to honor everyone's individuality, and we expect that our own individuality will be honored. And when we can do this, we get a kind of environment where the strength of the team is the individual, and the strength of the individual is the team. You get the best of both worlds. That's the idea behind a good 2x2 framework. But so why doesn't this happen? I think that's the question.
Yeah. So talk about, what leaders can do.
Yeah. So I think it is important to really understand what happens that moves us in the wrong direction, that moves us away from individuality towards demand and conformity, and what moves us towards coercion away from collaboration. And there's a million things, of course, but I'm going to boil it down to the big three: bias, prejudice, and bullying. And so one of the things that we can do as leaders is to begin to understand what gets in the way and what the difference between bias, prejudice, and bullying is. Because we often conflate bias, prejudice, and bullying as though they are the same thing. But actually, they're three very different things. So I want to offer you some super simple definitions about bias, prejudice, and bullying. Bias, I'm talking about unconscious bias, really, not meaning it is my definition for bias. Whereas prejudice, I'm going to define as meaning it. Prejudice is a very consciously held belief, usually incorporating some kind of inaccurate and unfair stereotype. And bullying is not about a belief, conscious or unconscious, just being mean. And so once we begin to separate these things out, we can begin to have a better idea about what we can do as leaders to prevent these things from destroying respect on our team.
Yeah.
You want some thoughts about?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, because I think one of the problems is, and you can teach this to your team as a leader, one of the problems is that and I want you to think about, like, when was the last time you were in a meeting or in a conversation with someone and they said or did something that was so cringeworthy, it sort of made your heart stop almost, but you didn't know what to say, like within the last 24 hours, probably. And this is a real problem when we don't say anything in those moments, whether we're the leader or the upstander or whether it's directed at us, because it means that we're not helping someone we care about. We're not helping our team work better together. It's going to hurt our results, but it also is going to hurt us. Like, it wakes you up at 3 a.m. and you suffer almost like a moral injury if you don't say anything. So what can you say when you don't know what to say? If you think it's bias, use an I statement. If you think it's prejudice, use an it statement. If you think it's bullying, use a you statement. So here's what I mean by that. Let's start with bias. One of my favorite stories about bias is a friend of mine she was at a very small company and they were meeting with a big company. So she and 2 colleagues went to this company and they were shown into a conference room with big, long, 30-person table. She had the expertise that was going to win her team the deal. So she sat in the center of the table and her 2 colleagues, who happened to be men, sat to her left. When the other side came in, the first person sat across from the guy to her left. The next person sat across from the guy to his left, and everybody else filed on down the table, leaving her dangling by herself. Often how bias shows up. She began talking. And when the other side had questions, they didn't direct them at her. They directed them at her 2 colleagues who were men. It happened once. It happened twice. You're nodding. You've seen this happen, right?
For sure.
Yeah. And it happened a 3rd time. And finally, one of her colleagues stood up and he said, "I think we should switch seats." That was all he had to do as both an upstander and a leader to totally change the dynamic in the room. And why did he do that? He did it for several different reasons. There's a practical consideration. He did it because he just wanted to win the deal. And he knew if he couldn't get them listening to her, that they wouldn't win the deal. There's also an emotional component. It bothered him that to see her who he respected get ignored. And so he wanted to do the right thing by her. But it wasn't that he thought, there's a third thing, which is sort of efficiency. It wasn't that he thought she couldn't speak up for herself, but he realized it was easier for him to speak up and easier for them to hear it from him than it would have been to hear from her that they were ignoring her. And then I think there's this fourth kind of self-preservation. He didn't want to wake up at 3 a.m. thinking, why didn't I say the thing, which happens, I think, to all of us. And so that was why he used the I statement. An I statement, he was sort of holding up a mirror. It invites the other person in to understand things from your perspective. You could also say, I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. I don't think you're intending to ignore her, whatever. So that's an example of an I statement. But if it's prejudice, holding up a mirror is not going to work because the other person is going to look in that mirror and they're going to like what they see. They're going to grin. They're going to be like, yeah, aren't I good looking? And so if it's prejudice, you need an it statement. An it statement draws a very clear boundary between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't impose that belief on others. So an it statement can appeal to a law, it can appeal to a company policy, or it can appeal to common sense. You want a story about?
Definitely.
All right. So this happened.
There's like, Kim, what's interesting about this, there's like seedlings of this in Radical Candor, because you do talk about gender bias. You also do talk about where you go to and we're debating of giving a talk to a company where you didn't agree necessarily with the values. So there is these seedlings I could see in Radical Candor.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about this, but it's interesting. I was also sort of in denial about the having experienced these problems. I think in part because I didn't want to think of myself as a victim, but I was even deeper in denial about the times when I was the one who had been the culprit, who had been disrespectful. So and as a leader, I was like, if I'm in charge, there will be no bias, prejudice, and bullying on my team. But of course there was. So anyway, at one point, prejudice, for the prejudice story and the it statement, how to use an it statement. I think that I had just returned from parental leave. And so I'd been out for about 5 months. I had just had twins. And I was chit-chatting with a guy before a meeting. And he said to me, my wife doesn't work because it's better for the children. And of course, at that moment in time, that felt kind of like a gut punch to me. But I didn't think he really meant it. I thought it was unconscious bias speaking. So I said to him, I decided to come to work today because I want to neglect my children. And I was expecting him to laugh. Yes, I was expecting him to have your reaction. He would laugh and apologize and we would move on. But no, that's not what happened. He doubled down. He said, oh no, Kim, it is really bad for your children that you are working. Ooh. And yes, oof. So now I know it's not unconscious bias. It's a very consciously held prejudice that he has. And so my I statement was not going to work. So I used an it statement and I said, it is a violation of company policy for you to tell me that I am neglecting my children to show up at work today. And that had the desired effect. He kind of backed off. And I said to him, look, I'm not going to make a thing of this with HR. I'm not going to over-delegate this conversation to HR. But now I'm going to use a second it statement, appealing to common sense rather than to the company policy. And I said, it is my decision together with my partner how we raise our children, just as it is your decision together with your wife how you raise your children. And that, he kind of was grokking that a little bit, but he still seemed a little uncertain. And I knew that I was going to have to work with him. So I tried, I took a third crack at this. And I said, it's my guess that you don't want to read my research any more than I want to read your research. And that very clearly, like, you can think what you want. I can think what I want. We don't even have to read each other's research. We just have to work together. And there's a whole host of things that you don't have to agree on in order to work well together. So that's one thought. I mean, if you really want to go deeper in terms of prejudice, I think it's a good idea to have the conversation if you want to have a deeper relationship. But you do not have to discuss you just have to say, you stay here, I stay there. But if it's bullying, telling someone where that boundary is not going to work, because the person is going to kick past that boundary. So if it's bullying, that's where you want a you statement. And I learned that from my daughter. She was in 3rd grade and she was getting bullied at school. And I was making a mistake that I think a lot of parents make. And I was telling her to use an I statement. I feel sad. Tell this child, I feel sad when you blah, 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 blah. And she banged her fist on the table and she said, Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they were succeeding? And I'm like, that is a really good point. And so in the case of bullying, you want a you statement. You can't talk to me like that. Or what's going on for you here? Or even just a you non sequitur. Where'd you get that shirt? And the point here is that when you're using a you statement, you're not accepting whatever it is that this person is dishing out at you. You're kind of pushing back and you're asking them to answer your questions. So I think that is helpful. And that's something as a leader that you can teach your team. You can also teach your team to disrupt bias in the moment. You can create a space for conversation about prejudice to make it clear to your team, where it's easy for me to sit here and say there's a line between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't impose it. That line gets drawn differently in different organizations, and it's your job as a leader to make it clear where it is on your team. And last but not least, in the case of bullying, you want to create consequences, sort of conversational consequences, compensation consequences, and also really career consequences for bullying. And then you want to make sure that you are taking the time to design your especially if you're a senior leader, to design your management systems to prevent power from making things go from bad to worse. If you don't design your management systems to create some checks and balances on power, then you wind up getting discrimination, harassment, and physical violations.
Yeah, I love this too, Kim, because it's applicable to life situations. Obviously, This isn't just leadership or business, but what you're talking on these concepts can be, like you mentioned with your daughter, because these are real life situations. I have 2 daughters, and I don't know, daughters can be, or girls can be cruel. I mean, I grew up, boys just kind of hit each other, but girls, like, verbally, it's like a psychological warfare more so, I have found in my experience than with boys. But this is really applicable to life situations.
Yeah.
So
and I think no matter whether what gender your children are, or whether they don't choose a gender, you want to make sure that you're equating sort of verbal violence with physical violence. Because sometimes I have twins, as I mentioned, and as they got older, I would find one of them would antagonize verbally the other until one hit the other, and it was tempting to punish the one who hit the other and let the other one off the hook. And it was important to recognize that both the verbal harassment as well as physical harassment of each other. I think that's an important point.
So, Kim, I know you have to go in a few. So my last question, first of all, I want to point people to check out radicalcandor.com. You can see the book Radical Candor and Radical Respect, and also obviously radicalrespectbook.com. My last question is just, how do people typically engage with you? What kind of services do you offer? I know obviously they can get the book. What else? How else can people work with you?
Sure. Well, we have a podcast, a Radical Candor podcast and a Radical Respect podcast. And if people have management questions or challenges, write them in and we'll often offer advice on the podcast free of charge. We also do talks and workshops at companies and for teams all over the world, actually. We have a bunch of Candor coaches as well as I do keynotes. And we're building a community for folks. We're building also a fake Kim Scott, FAIK, an AI version of me, because, I don't scale and people often want to ask me questions, but fake Kim Scott will scale. And you can criticize fake Kim Scott and make fake Kim Scott better. And you will never offend me by, it's one of the great opportunities of AI is that it's easier to give it feedback than to give a human being feedback. And it gets better. It works. And so we also built this great course called The Feedback Loop. We partnered with Second City, so you can check that out. That's an easy way for you to teach Radical Candor to your team.
I love it. Everyone check out radicalcandor.com and radicalrespectbook.com, and we'll see everyone next time. Kim, thank you so much.
Thank you. Really enjoyed the conversation.
What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sailing right now. I'm feeling like 100 grand.